Millionaire CEO husband embarrassed her in front of 200 visitors, and she signed divorce papers. Few moments later, 8 luxury cars arrived outside the gate. "My marriage to Vivian Monroe is officially over," the words echoed off the marble walls. Every head in the room turned. Every conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes found the woman standing frozen near the back of the ballroom, her cream dress suddenly feeling like a spotlight of shame. Vivian felt her heart stop beating. Her hands went cold. The champagne glass in her grip trembled so violently she had to set it down on the nearest table before it shattered. Julian continued, his voice smooth and practiced, as if he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. "You see, I made the mistake of believing that love could transcend circumstances, that a woman from humble origins could rise to meet the demands of my world." A nervous titter rippled through the crowd. Someone actually laughed, but some things cannot be taught. Julian's smile was cold, triumphant. Class, breeding, the instincts of old money. These are inherited, not acquired. Vivian couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. She could only stand there as the man she had loved for 4 years systematically destroyed her in front of everyone who mattered in his world. Vivian has been a pleasant companion during my journey to success. Pleasant companion. 3 years of marriage reduced to 2 words that made her sound like a well-trained pet. But as I enter this new phase, particularly with the merger with Castellan Holdings, I need a partner who can stand beside me, not behind me. He extended his hand toward someone in the crowd, and Vivian watched as Margot Castellan emerged like a predator who had finally caught her prey. Stunning in a crimson gown that probably cost more than most people's annual salary, diamonds dripping from her throat, a smile on her perfect lips that said she had won a competition Vivian hadn't even known she was part of. Margot has agreed to become the new Mrs. Blackwell. Julian's voice swelled with pride as his mistress took her place beside him. Together, we will build an empire that reshapes the industry. Applause erupted. Scattered at first, uncertain, as if the guests weren't sure whether they were supposed to celebrate a man publicly humiliating his wife. But then it grew, building like a wave, as 200 people chose power over decency and decided to align themselves with the winning side. Vivian stood alone in a sea of people who were all looking at her, whispering about her, pitying her, and not a single one stepped forward to defend her. Have you ever been destroyed by the person who was supposed to love you most? Have you ever stood in a room full of people and felt completely invisible? Have you ever given everything to someone who saw you as nothing? This is the story of a woman who hid her true identity to find real love, only to discover that the man she married was incapable of loving anything he couldn't control. A woman who was told she wasn't enough, would never be enough, could never belong in his world. But what Julian Blackwell didn't know, what no one in that glittering ballroom could have possibly guessed, was that the woman he had just publicly discarded was worth more than everyone in that room combined, and her family was about to remind him of that in the most spectacular way possible. Stay with me through this story of betrayal, revelation, and ultimate triumph. If you believe that karma always finds a way, hit that like button right now and let me know in the comments if you've ever witnessed someone get exactly what they deserved. Because what happens next, what happens in the next 60 seconds of this story, will change everything you think you know about power, wealth, and the true meaning of worth. But to understand the magnitude of what happened that night, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when Vivian Ashford made the decision that would change everything. 3 years and 6 months earlier, the Ashford family estate sprawled across 200 acres of prime Connecticut coastline, a private airstrip, a staff of 40, gardens that had been featured in architectural magazines, a wine cellar worth more than most people's lifetime earnings. If America had aristocracy, the Ashfords would be its crown. The family had built their fortune over 4 generations, starting with shipping ports on the eastern seaboard, and expanding into real estate, finance, and investments that touch nearly every major industry. By the time Eleanor Ashford took control of the empire after her husband's death, the family was worth more than the GDP of several small countries. Eleanor was not a woman who suffered fools. Silver-haired and sharp-eyed at 72, she ran her empire with the precision of a military general and the instincts of a chess grandmaster. Her children had given her 5 grandchildren, and she loved each of them fiercely, even when they drove her to distraction. Conrad, the eldest grandson, ran the shipping division with his father's pragmatism and his grandmother's ruthlessness. Dominic handled real estate, turning struggling properties into gold with an almost supernatural instinct for value. Isabella, the youngest at 20, was still finishing her degree at Yale, destined to take her place in the empire when the time came. And then there was Vivian. Vivian was the dreamer, the artist, the one who spent more time in her studio than in boardrooms. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's gentle eyes, and a sensitivity that seemed almost out of place in a family of sharks. She could paint emotions onto canvas in ways that made people weep. She could walk into a room and immediately sense the unspoken tensions, the hidden sorrows, the secret joys. She felt everything deeply, perhaps too deeply for a world that valued armor over authenticity. And by the age of 22, Vivian Ashford was suffocating. The charity gala was the same as every other charity gala. The same faces, the same conversations, the same young men circling her like vultures, their eyes calculating the worth of her last name rather than the worth of her heart. A particularly persistent one, Theodore something or other from an old banking family, had cornered her near the bar. "Vivian, you simply must come to the Hamptons this summer. Mother would love to have you." His smile was practiced. His interest was transparent. He didn't want her. He wanted what she represented. "That's very kind, Theodore. But I have plans this summer." Plans? He laughed as if the concept was absurd. What could possibly be more important than the Hamptons? Vivian looked at this man, with his perfect hair and his perfect suit and his perfect inability to see her as anything other than a merger opportunity, and something inside her cracked. "Excuse me," she said, and walked away without looking back. She found her grandmother on the terrace, watching the party through the French doors with an expression of tolerant amusement. "Running away, darling?" Eleanor asked without turning around. "Suffocating," Vivian admitted. Eleanor nodded slowly. "I remember that feeling. When your grandfather was alive, I often felt like I was drowning in expectations." Vivian moved to stand beside her grandmother, looking out at the manicured gardens, the perfect hedges, the carefully controlled beauty of their world. "How did you survive it?" "I found purpose." Eleanor turned to look at her granddaughter with those sharp, knowing eyes. "But you, my darling, are looking for something else entirely. You want to know if anyone could ever love you for yourself." The words hit Vivienne like a physical blow. "Yes, that's exactly it." "Then perhaps you should go find out." Vivian stared at her grandmother. "What do you mean?" "I mean that you have spent your entire life in a cage made of gold. Perhaps it's time to see what you can build without it. You're suggesting I leave. I'm suggesting you give yourself permission to discover who you are when no one knows your name." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. "Take 5 years. Change your name. Live anonymously. Find out if real love exists outside these walls. But the family, the expectations, your brothers can handle the business. Your sister is too young for it to matter. And I will always be watching, Vivian. Always. If you ever need me, I will come. But until then, you will have the freedom to fail, to struggle, to grow, to love without the weight of the Ashford name." Vivian felt tears pricking at her eyes. "You would let me do that. I built this empire so my grandchildren could choose their own paths." Eleanor reached out and took her granddaughter's hand. "What good is freedom if you never use it?" 2 weeks later, Vivian Ashford ceased to exist. In her place was Vivian Monroe, a 22-year-old artist with no family money, no connections, and a tiny apartment in Brooklyn that cost a fraction of what the Ashford estate spent on fresh flowers each month. The transformation was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Vivian learned to cook her own meals badly at first, then with growing competence. She learned to ride the subway, to navigate the city without a driver, to carry her own groceries up 4 flights of stairs because the building didn't have an elevator. She got a job teaching art at an underprivileged school in the Bronx. 23 children who had never held proper paintbrushes, who had never been told that their creativity mattered, who looked at her with suspicion at first, and then with something like hope. "Miss Monroe, why do you care if we learn to paint?" A 10-year-old named Marcus asked her one afternoon. "It's not like it's gonna get us jobs." Vivian knelt down to his level, looking into eyes that were far too cynical for his age. "Art isn't about jobs, Marcus. Art is about learning to see, learning to express what's inside you when words aren't enough, learning that your perspective matters, that your voice matters, that the way you see the world is worth sharing." She watched something shift in his expression. Skepticism giving way to curiosity. "That sounds fake. Maybe. But try it anyway. Pick up that brush and show me something real." He did, and what he painted, a swirl of angry reds and desperate blues that somehow captured the chaos of a childhood spent in survival mode, made Vivian's heart break and heal in the same moment. These children taught her more about resilience than she had ever learned in her sheltered life. They taught her about joy, found in small moments, about love that didn't come with conditions or contracts, about the raw honesty of people who had nothing to hide because they had nothing to lose. And in her tiny apartment, surrounded by canvases and paint supplies bought, with her modest salary, Vivian created the best art of her life. No one was watching, no one was judging, no one was calculating the market value of her work or wondering if it would bring prestige to the family name. She painted for herself, and for the first time in her life, she was free. The loneliness was harder than she had expected. There were nights when she missed her grandmother's wisdom, her brother's protective teasing, her sister's laughter. There were moments when she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake, giving up everything for an experiment that might prove nothing. But then she would wake up in the morning and realize that no one knew who she was. No one was trying to use her. No one was calculating her worth based on her bloodline. And that freedom was worth any amount of loneliness. She had been Vivian Monroe for 18 months when she walked into a coffee shop in Brooklyn and changed her life forever. The coffee shop was called Grounded, a small, quirky place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. Vivian came here 3 mornings a week to sketch before her afternoon classes, losing herself in the faces of strangers and the play of light through the windows. She was deep in concentration, her pencil moving across her sketchbook, when a voice interrupted her. "That's remarkable." Vivian looked up to find a man standing beside her table, his eyes fixed on her sketch. He was tall, dark-haired, with the kind of sharp features that photographers loved. Expensive suit, but slightly disheveled, as if he had thrown it on without thinking. Watch worth more than her monthly rent. But he didn't wear it like a status symbol. "I'm sorry." Vivian instinctively covered her sketchbook, uncomfortable with the intrusion. "No, I'm sorry." The man held up his hands in apology. "I didn't mean to intrude. It's just that I've been watching you draw for the past 20 minutes, and the focus, the intensity, it's captivating. You've been watching me for 20 minutes. That sounds creepy when you say it out loud." He laughed, and something about the sound was disarming. Genuine. "I'm Julian Blackwell, and I promise I'm not usually the guy who interrupts strangers in coffee shops. Vivian Monroe, would you mind if I sat down? I'll buy you a coffee as an apology for the creepy watching." Every instinct told her to say no. She had spent 18 months carefully guarding her anonymity, avoiding connections that might complicate her experiment. But there was something about Julian Blackwell that made her want to say yes. "One coffee." He sat down across from her, ordering 2 lattes from the passing waitress without looking at the menu. His attention never left Vivian's face. "So, Vivian Monroe, tell me about yourself." "There's not much to tell. I'm an artist. I teach at a school in the Bronx. I live in a tiny apartment with questionable plumbing." Julian's eyebrows rose. "A starving artist. In Brooklyn. How perfectly cliché," says the man in the expensive suit who watches strangers in coffee shops. He laughed again. "Touché. I run a tech company. Very boring. Very corporate. Nothing like what you do." "What do I do?" "You create." He gestured at her sketchbook. "You capture something real and put it on paper. I just move numbers around and pretend it matters." Vivian found herself smiling despite her caution. "That's a very cynical view of your own work. I'm a very cynical person. Or I was, until about 20 minutes ago." "What changed 20 minutes ago?" "I saw someone who was completely absorbed in what they were doing. No performance, no pretense, just pure focus on something that mattered to them." Julian leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. "Do you know how rare that is? Especially in my world." "I don't know anything about your world." "Good." He sat back with a satisfied expression. "Keep it that way. My world is exhausting." They talked for 2 hours, then 3. Julian asked questions about her art, her students, her life in Brooklyn. He listened to her answers like they actually mattered. He told her about his company, a tech startup he had built from nothing that was starting to attract serious investor attention. He spoke about late nights and uncertain outcomes and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who wanted something from you rather than genuinely connecting with you. "That's why I like this coffee shop," Julian admitted. No one here knows who I am. No one here cares. Vivian understood that sentiment more than he could possibly know. When they finally parted, Julian insisted on getting her phone number. I know this is forward, but I haven't had a conversation this real in years. Please let me see you again. Vivian hesitated. She had carefully avoided romantic entanglements since becoming Vivian Monroe. Romance meant vulnerability. Vulnerability meant potential exposure. But there was something about Julian that felt different. Something that felt like the authentic connection she had been searching for. One dinner, she said. But I'm choosing the restaurant. Julian's smile lit up his entire face. Deal. He called her the next day. And the day after that, and every day for the following week until their dinner finally happened. Vivian chose a tiny Italian restaurant in her neighborhood. No white tablecloths, no wine lists longer than novels. Just good food, reasonable prices, and the kind of warm atmosphere that couldn't be manufactured. Julian arrived in casual clothes, jeans and a sweater that somehow made him look more handsome than his suits. He didn't complain about the cramped seating or the lack of valet parking. He ate his pasta with genuine pleasure and asked for seconds of the bread basket. This is perfect, he told her. Absolutely perfect. Most people would want somewhere fancier. Most people are idiots. Julian reached across the table and took her hand. Vivian, I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who care more about appearances than reality. Fancy restaurants with terrible food but impressive decor. Parties where everyone is performing instead of connecting. Relationships built on what we can do for each other's careers rather than genuine feeling. That sounds exhausting. It is. But you're real. You're not trying to be anything other than yourself. And I find that incredibly attractive. Vivian felt her defenses crumbling. He seemed so sincere, so different from the Theodore something or others of her old life. You don't even know me, she said softly. Then, let me learn. What followed was the most intense 6 months of Vivian's life. Julian pursued her with a passion that took her breath away. He showed up at her school with flowers. He attended her students' art shows and praised their work with genuine interest. He spent hours in her tiny apartment, watching her paint, asking questions about her process, treating her creativity like a gift rather than an eccentricity. He shared his own vulnerabilities. The father who had never believed in him, the early failures that had nearly broken him, the determination to prove everyone wrong that drove him to build his company from nothing. I didn't have your advantages, Vivian, he told her one night as they lay tangled together in her narrow bed. No family money, no connections. Everything I have, I built with my own hands. The irony was almost painful. Here was a man who thought she was poor, who believed they came from similar circumstances, who had no idea that she had walked away from a fortune that dwarfed his wildest ambitions. She should have told him the truth. She knew she should. But every time she tried, fear stopped her throat. If he knew she was an Ashford, everything would change. He would look at her differently. He would wonder if she had been testing him, judging him, slumming it for entertainment. She convinced herself that she would tell him after they were solid, after their love was secure enough to survive the revelation. I want to marry you, Julian said 6 months after they met. He was on one knee in the coffee shop where they had first spoken, a modest diamond ring in his hand. I know we haven't been together long. I know I don't have much to offer you yet, but I have never felt this way about anyone. Say yes, Vivian. Build a life with me. She should have told him then. Instead, she said yes. They married at City Hall 3 weeks later. Vivian wore a simple white dress she had bought secondhand. Julian wore the one suit that wasn't designed for boardrooms. There were no guests, no photographers, no society columns to cover the event. Just the two of them, making promises they both believed they would keep. Vivian had never been happier. She convinced herself that the truth could wait, that telling Julian about her family would only complicate things, that their love was strong enough to survive any revelation, so there was no urgency to risk it. The first year of marriage was everything Vivian had hoped for. They moved into a modest apartment together. Julian's company was growing but not yet profitable, so money was tight in ways that Vivian found oddly freeing. She continued teaching. He continued building. They supported each other through setbacks and celebrated each other's victories. I love coming home to you, Julian would say, wrapping his arms around her after another long day at the office. You're the only thing that makes sense in my life. Vivian believed him. She believed that they had built something real, something that transcended. money and status, and all the superficial markers that her old world valued. She painted constantly during that first year, the best work of her life, pouring her happiness onto canvas in colors that seemed to glow from within. Julian hung every piece on their walls, praising her talent to anyone who would listen. "My wife is a genius," he would tell his investors, his employees, anyone who visited their home. "A real artist, not like the pretentious gallery types. She creates from the soul." Vivian would blush and deflect, but secretly she treasured every word. Here was a man who loved her for her essence, not her inheritance. Here was proof that real love existed outside the golden cage of the Ashford name. The shift began so gradually that Vivian almost didn't notice it at first. It started with the investors. Julian's company had finally attracted serious money, and suddenly their modest apartment was hosting dinner parties with men in suits worth more than their monthly rent. Vivian did her best to be a good hostess, but she felt increasingly out of place in conversations about market valuations and acquisition strategies. Julian noticed. "Maybe you could talk a little less about your students," he suggested one morning after a particularly awkward dinner party. "The investors don't really relate to that kind of thing. What should I talk about?" "I don't know. Just try to fit in more." It was the first time he had ever asked her to be something other than herself. Vivian told herself it was reasonable. These were important dinners. She should make an effort to discuss topics that interested their guests. But then the suggestions kept coming. "Maybe don't wear the paint-stained clothes when we have company. Could you try to do something different with your hair? Something more polished? I've hired an image consultant, just to help you feel more comfortable at events." Each request was reasonable on its own. Each adjustment was small, but taken together, they added up to a message that became increasingly clear. The woman Julian had fallen in love with was no longer good enough. By the second year of their marriage, Julian's company had become a genuine success. The modest apartment became a penthouse. The dinner parties became galas. The image consultant became a permanent fixture in Vivian's life, scheduling her for spa treatments and shopping trips and etiquette refreshers. "You're representing the Blackwell brand now," Julian explained when she protested. "People are watching us. We need to present the right image." "What's wrong with my image?" "Nothing's wrong. I just want to help you feel more confident." But Vivian didn't feel more confident. She felt increasingly invisible. Julian started attending events without her, important dinners where she wouldn't fit in, industry parties where her presence might be a distraction, charity galas where he needed to focus on networking rather than babysitting his wife. That was his word, babysitting. "You don't really enjoy these things anyway," he would say. "Wouldn't you rather stay home and paint?" She would rather have been by his side, but she had learned that expressing that preference led to arguments she could never win. Julian's mother, Helena Blackwell, made her opinions even clearer. Helena had been skeptical of Vivian from the beginning, a nobody from nowhere who had somehow captured her son's attention. But as Julian's success grew, Helena's skepticism transformed into open hostility. "I'm sure you're a lovely girl," Helena said during one particularly painful Sunday dinner. But Julian could have married anyone. Families have been positioning their daughters for years, and he chose someone with no background whatsoever. "I love your son, Mrs. Blackwell. Love." Helena's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Love doesn't run empires, dear. Love doesn't produce heirs with the right bloodline. Love doesn't open the doors that Julian needs opened." Vivian looked at Julian, waiting for him to defend her. He said nothing. That night she tried to talk to him about his mother's comments. "She's just old-fashioned," Julian dismissed. "Don't take it personally. She basically said, 'I'm not good enough for you.' She said, 'You're not from the right background.' That's different." "Is it? Because it sounds like the same thing." Julian sighed, the expression of a patient man dealing with an unreasonable woman. "Vivian, I married you. Isn't that proof enough that I think you're good enough?" But his actions told a different story. The art supplies Vivian had bought were slowly replaced with approved decor. Her paintings, once proudly displayed, were removed to make room for more sophisticated pieces. Her teaching job was gently discouraged until she quit entirely, leaving her isolated from the children who had given her purpose. "You have everything you could want here," Julian reasoned. "Why exhaust yourself with that commute?" "Because it matters to me. I matter more." And that was the argument Vivian could never win, because saying that her work mattered more than her husband would make her the villain in their story. And Julian was very skilled at making himself the victim. By the third year of their marriage, Vivian had become a ghost in her own life. She moved through the penthouse like a shadow, present but unnoticed. She smiled at events she was occasionally permitted to attend. She made small talk with people who looked through her. She went to bed alone most nights while Julian worked late or attended functions where her presence wasn't required. The woman who had once painted with passion and taught with purpose now spent her days in empty rooms, wondering where she had gone. She still painted sometimes, in secret, hiding her canvases in a storage closet Julian never entered. The paintings were dark now, shadows and silences and the particular loneliness of being invisible to someone who was supposed to love you. One night, she gathered the courage to confront him. "Julian, we need to talk." He looked up from his phone with obvious irritation. "Can it wait? I have calls to make." "No, it can't wait." Vivian's voice trembled but held. "I feel like I'm disappearing, like you don't see me anymore, like everything about me that you used to love has become something you're embarrassed by." Julian set down his phone with exaggerated patience. "Vivian, I'm building an empire. I'm under enormous pressure. I'm sorry if I haven't been as attentive as you'd like, but I'm doing this for us." "Are you?" "Because it feels like you're doing it for yourself, and I'm just supposed to be grateful for the privilege of watching. That's unfair." "Is it? When was the last time you asked about my art? When was the last time you came home and actually talked to me instead of retreating to your office? When was the last time you made me feel like your wife instead of your liability?" Julian's expression shifted, the patient mask slipping to reveal something colder underneath. "I married you when you had nothing," he said quietly. "I gave you this life, this penthouse, these clothes. Everything you have is because of me. I had a life before you. Did you? Because from what I remember, you were teaching in a crumbling school and living in an apartment with questionable plumbing. That's not a life. That's survival." Vivian felt like she had been slapped. That apartment was mine. That job was mine. I chose that life because I wanted to create something real. Real. Julian laughed, and the sound was nothing like the warm, genuine laugh she had fallen in love with. "Reality is expensive, Vivian. Reality is power and connections and the ability to shape the world. What you had wasn't real. It was a fantasy. I was happy. You were naive. There's a difference." That night, Vivian lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of the penthouse she didn't feel was home. She thought about calling her grandmother. One phone call, and everything would change. Eleanor would send the cars, the lawyers, the protection of the Ashford name. But that would mean admitting that the experiment had failed, that she had given up her identity to find real love, and instead had found a man who loved a version of her that no longer existed. Pride kept her silent. Fear kept her frozen. And the slow erosion of her self-worth continued, so gradual that she barely noticed the ground disappearing beneath her feet. 3 months before the gala, Vivian found the first text. She hadn't meant to snoop. Julian had left his phone on the bathroom counter while he showered, and it had buzzed with a message that appeared on the locked screen. "Can't wait for this farce to be over. Soon, my love. M." Vivian's heart stopped. She stared at the words until the screen went dark, then stared at the blank screen until her vision blurred with tears. Margot, the Castellan heiress who seemed to appear at every event Julian attended. The woman whose eyes followed him across rooms. The woman Julian always seemed to find time to chat with while Vivian stood alone in corners. When Julian emerged from the shower, Vivian confronted him. "Who is him?" His face gave nothing away. "What are you talking about?" "The text on your phone. Can't wait for this farce to be over." "Who sent that?" "You went through my phone. It was on the counter." The message popped up. "Don't change the subject." "Who is M?" Julian wrapped a towel around his waist with deliberate calm. "You're being paranoid. It was probably a business contact using informal language. Business contact. Calling something a farce and signing it my love. Vivian." His voice was cold, controlled. "You need to stop this. This jealousy, this insecurity, it's not attractive. I'm not being jealous. I'm asking a reasonable question. You're accusing me of something based on a text you misread on a screen you shouldn't have been looking at. That's not reasonable. That's crazy." "I'm not crazy. Aren't you?" Julian stepped closer, and suddenly his physical presence felt threatening in a way it never had before. "You live in a penthouse you didn't pay for. You wear clothes I bought you. You haven't worked in a year, and you're standing here accusing me of infidelity because of a text message." Vivian stepped back. I'm asking you to tell me the truth. The truth is that you're paranoid and ungrateful. The truth is that I've given you everything and you're looking for reasons to be unhappy. The truth is that if you keep pushing this, you might not like what you find." He walked past her into the bedroom, leaving her standing in the bathroom with the steam from his shower still hanging in the air. She didn't ask again. She should have left. She knows that now, looking back. She should have walked out that night, called her grandmother, admitted defeat, and started over. But she didn't. She stayed, because leaving felt like failure. Because she still believed, stupidly, that the man she had married was somewhere inside the cold stranger he had become. Because she had invested so much of herself in this marriage that walking away felt like losing everything. And so she stayed, and she smiled, and she pretended that everything was fine. Until the night of the gala. The invitation arrived 3 weeks before the event. "Vivian, you need to attend this one," Julian said, sliding the embossed card across the breakfast table. "It's our anniversary gala, the annual celebration of Blackwell Industries. It would look strange if my wife wasn't there. I thought you preferred to attend these things alone. This one is different." Julian's smile didn't reach his eyes. "This one, I need you to be seen." Something about his tone made Vivian uneasy. But she nodded, as she had learned to nod to everything, and began the elaborate process of preparing for a society event. The image consultant selected her dress. A simple cream gown that was elegant enough for the occasion, but unremarkable enough that she wouldn't draw attention. The message was clear. Be present. Don't stand out. Vivian's hair was styled into a sophisticated updo. Her makeup applied with professional precision. Her jewelry chosen to be tasteful rather than statement-making. When she looked in the mirror on the night of the gala, she barely recognized herself. The artist who had once worn paint-stained jeans with pride had been replaced by a polished mannequin who existed only to complete Julian Blackwell's image. "You look fine," Julian said when she emerged from the dressing room. His attention was on his phone, not on her. "We need to leave in 10 minutes. Fine. Not beautiful. Not stunning. Not even good. Just fine." The car ride to the Blackwell estate was silent. Julian typed on his phone the entire way, occasionally smiling at messages that didn't include Vivian. She watched the city lights pass outside the window and tried to remember. The woman who had once been brave enough to walk away from everything. That woman felt like a stranger from another life. The Blackwell estate was magnificent in the worst possible way. A sprawling mansion that had been built to intimidate rather than welcome. Manicured grounds that looked artificial under the carefully positioned lights. Valets in uniforms taking keys from guests who arrived in cars worth more than houses. 200 of the city's most influential people would be attending tonight. Business leaders, politicians, society figures, the kind of people who could make or break careers with a whispered word. And Vivian was supposed to smile and make small talk and pretend she belonged among them. "Remember," Julian said as they approached the entrance, "don't talk too much. Don't mention your art. Just smile and be pleasant. I know the rules." "Good." He walked away without offering his arm, leaving her to follow like an afterthought. Inside, the ballroom was exactly as oppressive as Vivian had expected. Crystal chandeliers casting cold light across marble floors. An orchestra playing music that nobody listened to. Champagne and flutes that cost more than her former students' families made in a month. Laughter that sounded performed rather than genuine. Julian immediately vanished into the crowd, shaking hands and slapping backs with the easy confidence of a man in his element. He didn't look back to see if Vivian was following. She wasn't. Instead, she found a quiet corner near the back of the ballroom and picked up a champagne flute she had no intention of drinking. She watched the party swirl around her, feeling more invisible than ever. "I know what you're thinking. Why didn't she just leave? Why didn't she walk out, call her grandmother, end this nightmare once and for all?" But here's the thing about emotional abuse that people who haven't experienced it don't understand. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly in tiny increments, so gradually that you don't realize how far you've fallen until you can no longer see the surface. Vivian had been told she was too much and not enough for so long that she had started to believe it. She had been isolated from her support system, cut off from her purpose, reduced to a decorative object in her husband's life. She didn't leave because she had forgotten that she could. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt trapped in a relationship that dimmed your light, drop a heart in the comments. You're not alone. And what happens next in this story might just remind you that it's never too late to find your way back to yourself. The first 2 hours of the gala passed in a blur of polite small talk and careful avoidance. Vivian spoke when spoken to, smiled when required, and slowly counted the minutes until she could reasonably suggest leaving. She saw Margot Castellan across the room several times, stunning in a crimson gown that seemed designed to draw every eye. Margot was always near Julian, always leaning close, always laughing at his jokes with an intimacy that made Vivian's stomach turn. She tried to catch Julian's eye once, to remind him that his wife was here, was present, was waiting for some acknowledgement that she existed. He looked right through her. That was when she knew. She knew with absolute certainty that the marriage was over, that whatever had existed between them had died long ago, and she had simply been too afraid to acknowledge the corpse. She didn't know yet how brutal the ending would be. At exactly 9 o'clock, the orchestra stopped playing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian's voice rang out across the suddenly silent ballroom. "May I have your attention, please?" Vivian looked up to see her husband standing at the top of the grand staircase. His posture was confident. His smile was triumphant. His eyes, when they briefly met hers across the room, were cold as winter steel. "Tonight, we celebrate not just 3 years of Blackwell Industries' success, but also the beginning of an exciting new chapter." The crowd murmured with anticipation. Vivian felt her heart rate increase, sensing danger she couldn't quite name. As many of you know, I've always believed in evolution, in shedding what no longer serves us to embrace what elevates us. Shedding. The word hit Vivian like a warning, which is why I'm announcing tonight that my marriage to Vivian Monroe is officially over. The ballroom fell completely silent. 200 heads turned toward Vivian like choreographed dancers. 200 pairs of eyes found her standing frozen near the back wall, her champagne glass trembling in her grip. This isn't happening, she thought. This can't be happening. But it was. You see, Julian continued, his voice carrying effortlessly across the stunned crowd, I made the mistake of believing that love could transcend circumstances, that a woman from humble origins could rise to meet the demands of my world. Someone in the crowd gasped. Someone else laughed nervously. Vivienne couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only stand there as the man who had promised to love her forever systematically destroyed her in front of everyone who would ever matter in this city. But some things cannot be taught. Julian's smile was cruel now, openly mocking. Class, breeding, the instincts of old money. These are inherited, not acquired. The words hit Vivian like physical blows. Each one landed precisely where it would hurt most, exploiting every insecurity he had learned over 3 years of intimate knowledge. Vivian has been a pleasant companion during my journey to success. Pleasant companion. 3 years of marriage. 3 years of love and sacrifice and slow suffocation, reduced to 2 words that made her sound like a comfortable piece of furniture. But as I enter this new phase, particularly with the merger with Castellan Holdings, I need a partner who can stand beside me, not behind me. Someone who understands the language of power. Someone like... He extended his hand toward the crowd, and Vivian watched in horror as Margot Castellan emerged from the sea of guests. The crimson gown was a statement now, a declaration of victory. The diamonds at her throat caught the light as she climbed the stairs to take her place beside Julian. Margot has agreed to become the new Mrs. Blackwell. The announcement hung in the air for one eternal second. Then applause began to ripple through the crowd. Scattered at first, uncertain, as if the guests weren't sure whether they were supposed to celebrate a public execution. But it grew, building like a wave, as 200 people chose to align themselves with power rather than propriety. Vivian stood alone in a ballroom full of applauding people, and not a single one of them met her eyes. Together, Julian continued, wrapping his arm around Margot's waist with possessive familiarity. We will build an empire that reshapes the industry. More applause. Margot's triumphant smile, Julian's cold satisfaction, and Vivian, frozen at the back of the room, watching her life collapse around her. She should cry. She knew she should cry. That was what was expected of her. The discarded wife, publicly humiliated, breaking down in front of everyone. But something else was happening inside her. Something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Anger. Not the weak, apologetic anger that had been beaten out of her through years of gaslighting. Real anger. The kind of rage that burns clean and hot and clarifying. Julian descended the staircase with Margot on his arm, the crowd parting to let them pass. They walked directly toward Vivian, and she realized with cold clarity that this was also part of the performance. The victors approaching the vanquished, the new queen displacing the old. "I've had the divorce papers drawn up," Julian said when he reached her. His voice was low, but deliberately audible to everyone pretending not to listen. "Sign them tonight, and I'll ensure you receive a reasonable settlement, enough to return to whatever life you had before you met me." He produced a leather folder from his jacket. The divorce papers inside were already flagged with colored tabs indicating where she should sign. "You're doing this here," Vivian said. Her voice was steadier than she expected. "In front of everyone. I thought you'd prefer a quick, clean break." Julian's smile was patronizing. Prolonging this would only be uncomfortable for everyone. Vivian looked at the papers, then at the man she had loved, then at the woman who had replaced her. The anger inside her grew hotter, brighter, more clarifying. "Do you have a pen?" she asked quietly. Julian's smile widened. Victory confirmed. Of course. He handed her an elegant fountain pen, probably worth more than most people's monthly salary. Vivian accepted it with steady hands. She didn't read the terms. She didn't negotiate. She didn't beg or cry or make a scene. She simply signed her name on every flagged line, her handwriting bold and clear. When she was finished, she closed the folder and handed it back to Julian. "I hope you find whatever you're looking for," she said. "I genuinely do." Then she turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted for her. The whispers followed her. 200 pairs of eyes burned into her back as she made the longest walk of her life. She had almost reached the door when she heard it. The sound of engines. Multiple engines. Powerful engines. Approaching the estate with deliberate purpose. Everyone turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the front drive. Headlights were piercing the darkness. Not one set. Not two. 8. 8 vehicles approaching the gates like a convoy, like an invasion, like an army. The butler rushed to Julian's side, his professional composure cracking. "Sir, there are 8 vehicles at the gate. Luxury vehicles. They're requesting immediate entry." Julian frowned. 8. "I'm not expecting any additional guests." "They say they're here for Mrs. Blackwell, sir." The butler's voice trembled slightly. "And they're not requesting permission anymore. They're coming through." The gates swung open. 8 black vehicles, Rolls-Royces and armored Mercedes, paraded up the circular drive with the precision of a military escort. Vivian stood frozen near the door, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and something that felt dangerously like hope. The lead vehicles stopped at the front entrance. A uniformed driver emerged to open the rear door, and the woman who stepped out changed everything. The woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle was silver-haired and regal, carrying herself with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to command attention. Her dress was simple black, elegant without being ostentatious, but the diamonds at her throat caught the light in a way that made several guests gasp audibly. Those diamonds alone were worth more than the entire Blackwell estate. Behind her, from the remaining 7 vehicles, emerged an entourage that made Julian's security team look like amateur hour. Men and women in impeccable business attire. Lawyers, obviously, their briefcases gleaming with purpose. A private security detail that moved with military precision. And finally, 2 tall men and 1 young woman who looked like younger versions of Vivian herself. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Even the whispers had stopped. 200 of the city's most powerful people stood frozen, watching something unprecedented unfold. Julian stepped forward, his confidence faltering for the first time all evening. "What is the meaning of this?" His voice was sharp, but there was an edge of uncertainty underneath. "This is a private event." The silver-haired woman didn't spare him a glance. Her eyes were fixed on Vivian, and something in her expression softened with an emotion that looked remarkably like tenderness. "My darling girl." Her voice carried across the silent ballroom with perfect clarity. "It's time to come home." The words hung in the air like a spell being broken. Julian's face cycled through confusion, then recognition, then dawning horror. Everyone who moved in elite circles knew that face. Everyone who mattered in the worlds of business, finance, and society knew exactly who had just walked through the doors of his gala. Eleanor Ashford, matriarch of the Ashford dynasty, one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet, a woman whose influence extended into governments, industries, and markets that Julian Blackwell could only dream of accessing. The whispered name spread through the crowd like wildfire. Eleanor Ashford. The Eleanor Ashford. What is she doing here? Did she say darling girl? What is happening? Vivian felt her legs trembling as she took a step toward the woman who had given her permission to find herself 3.5 years ago. Grandmother. Her voice cracked on the word, breaking through years of carefully maintained composure. I gave you 3 years. Eleanor moved toward her granddaughter with the grace of a woman half her age. 3 years to find your own path, just as you asked. But I never stopped watching, Vivian. I always watched. And when I learned what you've been enduring, I knew it was time to intervene. The 2 tall men from the convoy moved to flank Vivian. Conrad, her eldest brother, his jaw tight with barely controlled fury. Dominic, the middle brother, his eyes promising violence to anyone who had hurt his sister. And Isabella, the youngest, tears streaming down her face as she rushed forward to embrace Vivienne with desperate relief. We've been so worried, Isabella whispered into her sister's hair. We've missed you so much. Vivian held her sister tightly, feeling something inside her chest begin to crack open. The shell she had built around herself over 3 years of careful survival was splintering, and underneath it was a grief and relief so profound she could barely breathe. Julian's voice cut through the reunion, sharp with panic. Wait. His composure had completely abandoned him now. Wait. Grandmother. Your grandmother is Eleanor Ashford. The Eleanor Ashford. Vivian released her sister and turned to face her husband for what she knew would be the final time. The man who had called her simple, unsophisticated, unworthy of his world. The man who had just publicly humiliated her in front of everyone who mattered. My name is Vivian Ashford. Her voice was stronger now, steadier, carrying the authority of 4 generations of power. I was born into one of the oldest and wealthiest families in this country. I gave it up because I wanted to be loved for myself, not my inheritance. I wanted to prove that I could build a life on my own terms. Julian's face went white. The color literally drained from his cheeks as the magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a tidal wave. You lied to me. His voice was hoarse, barely recognizable. For 3 years, you lied. I omitted. Vivian corrected. And there was steel in her voice now, forged in the fire of 3 years of diminishment. And can you honestly blame me? You just spent 5 minutes publicly degrading me for being poor, for being unsophisticated, for not having the breeding required to stand beside you. What would you have done if you'd known the truth from the beginning? Julian had no answer. His mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. You would have married me for my money, Vivian continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. You would have treated me like a prize instead of a project. But the contempt would have come eventually, because it was never about where I came from, Julian. It was about who you are. Margot Castellan had gone pale beside Julian, her triumphant smile completely erased. Her eyes darted between Julian and Eleanor Ashford, calculating rapidly, realizing that the merger she had been promised was suddenly looking far less certain. Mrs. Ashford, Margot attempted, her voice pitched to ingratiate. I had no idea. If I had known who Vivian was, I never would have. Save your breath. Eleanor's voice was ice, cutting through Margot's protests without mercy. I know exactly who you are, Miss Castellan, and exactly what your family's company is worth, which I should mention is significantly less than it was this morning. What do you mean? I mean that Castellan Holdings' primary shipping contracts, the ones that were supposed to fund your precious merger, were managed through Ashford Maritime. We're being the operative word. As of 6 hours ago, those contracts have been terminated. Margot's face went from pale to ashen. You can't do that. I believe I just did. That's corporate warfare. Julian finally found his voice, outrage replacing his shock. You can't just destroy a company because of personal grievances. Eleanor Ashford turned her full attention to Julian Blackwell for the first time, and watching her face, Vivian almost felt sorry for him. Almost. It's business, Mr. Blackwell. Eleanor's smile was razor sharp, the smile of a woman who had been destroying overconfident men for longer than Julian had been alive. Surely you understand business. One of the lawyers stepped forward, handing Julian a thick folder of documents. Julian took it automatically, his hands visibly shaking. What is this? He demanded. A comprehensive audit of Blackwell Industries' financial dealings over the past 3 years. The lawyer's voice was professionally neutral, but there was an undercurrent of satisfaction, including several creative accounting practices that would be of great interest to federal regulators. Julian opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages with growing horror. You'll also find documentation of Mr. Blackwell's affair with Miss Castellan which began 14 months ago. The lawyer continued, relentless. Photographs, hotel receipts, correspondence. More than enough for a court to find Mr. Blackwell at fault in any divorce proceedings. Divorce proceedings. Julian's head snapped up. She just signed the papers I prepared. Those papers are null and void. Another lawyer interjected, stepping forward with additional documents. Mrs. Ashford, Vivian, signed under duress, in a public setting, without legal counsel present, immediately following an orchestrated public humiliation designed to pressure her into compliance. No court in this country would uphold such a document. Eleanor stepped closer to Julian, and despite being half a head shorter than him, she somehow managed to look down at him with withering contempt. My granddaughter will be filing for divorce on her terms, Mr. Blackwell. And given the evidence of adultery, emotional abuse, and financial impropriety, I suspect the settlement will be substantial. You can't prove emotional abuse, Julian hissed, grasping for any defense. I have 3 years of documentation. Vivian's voice was quiet but devastating. Every cutting remark, every public dismissal, every time you called me simple or unsophisticated or not good enough. I wrote it all down, Julian. I was hoping someday I'd look back and realize I was exaggerating. She paused, letting the silence stretch. I wasn't. The ballroom had become a theater of whispered scandal. 200 of the city's elite were watching Julian Blackwell's empire crumble in real time, and not a single one of them was moving to help him. The same people who had applauded his announcement minutes ago were now carefully distancing themselves, recalculating allegiances, preparing to align with the winning side. Helena Blackwell pushed through the crowd, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. This is outrageous. Helena's voice was shrill with desperation. You can't just barge into our event and make accusations. Eleanor regarded Helena with the mild interest one might show a particularly loud insect. Mrs. Blackwell, I don't believe we've been formally introduced. I'm Eleanor Ashford. Your son has been emotionally abusing my granddaughter for 3 years. While conducting an affair with his business partner's daughter, I'm here to collect what's mine and ensure he faces appropriate consequences. Helena's mouth opened and closed, but no words emerged. For perhaps the first time in her life, she had encountered someone whose social standing so thoroughly eclipsed her own that her usual weapons were useless. I loved you. Julian's voice was suddenly desperate, his earlier cruelty replaced by something that might have been genuine emotion. Vivian, please. I loved you. I really did. Vivian looked at the man she had married, the man she had given up everything for, the man who had slowly, systematically dismantled her sense of self until she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. Maybe you did, she said, finally. In the beginning, maybe there was something real there. But you loved your ambition more, Julian. You loved power and status and the image you wanted to project. And when I didn't fit that image, you tried to erase me instead of examining your own values. I can change. He stepped toward her, and immediately Conrad and Dominic moved to block his path. I can be different, now that I know who you really are. That's exactly the point, Julian. Vivian's voice held a sadness that ran deeper than anger. You only want me now because you know what I'm worth on paper. But 3 years ago, when you thought I was nobody, you saw nothing in me worth treasuring. You looked at the woman I was, the artist, the teacher, the person, who loved you with everything she had, and you found her lacking. Vivian. Julian's voice cracked. I hope you find what you're looking for, Vivian said, and there was genuine compassion in her voice now, pity rather than rage. But I suspect it doesn't exist, because you've been looking for worth in money and status and power, when the only thing that ever really mattered was whether you could love someone without conditions. She turned to her grandmother, her brothers, her sister, the family she had walked away from 3.5 years ago, searching for something real. I'm ready to go home. Eleanor nodded, wrapping a protective arm around her granddaughter's shoulders. Then let's go home, darling. Your family has missed you terribly. The Ashford entourage began moving toward the exit, the crowd parting before them like the Red Sea. Vivian walked with her head held high, her brothers flanking her protectively, her sister clutching her hand, her grandmother leading the way. At the door, she paused. One final look back at the glittering ballroom, at the stunned faces of 200 people who had just witnessed the most spectacular reversal in society history, at the man she had once loved standing frozen in the center of his crumbling empire. Julian was staring after her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Loss. Real, devastating loss. the understanding, finally, of what he had thrown away. Margot was already backing away from him, distancing herself from disaster. Helena was arguing with the Ashford lawyers, her voice growing more shrill and desperate by the moment. The guests were whispering, photographing, preparing to spread the story across every social circle in the city. And Vivian Ashford walked out of the Blackwell estate without looking back. Outside, the cool night air felt like the first breath after drowning. Vivian stood on the front steps, filling her lungs with possibility for the first time in 3 years. The 8 vehicles waited in the drive, engines purring, ready to carry her away from the nightmare she had been living. "Are you all right?" Conrad asked, his voice gruff with concern. "I will be," Vivian replied. "I think I will be. I wanted to kill him," Dominic muttered. "When grandmother showed us those reports, what he'd been doing to you, I wanted to fly here and end him. Violence wouldn't have helped." Vivian leaned into her brother's protective anger, grateful for it, even as she rejected the impulse. This was better. He'll have to live with knowing exactly what he lost. Isabella hugged her from behind. "I'm so glad you're coming home. The house has been so empty without you. I've missed you all so much." Vivian's voice broke on the words. "I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I was too proud to admit I'd failed." Eleanor turned to face her granddaughter, her sharp eyes softening. "You didn't fail, darling. You learned. You discovered exactly what you needed to know about the world and about yourself. That's not failure. That's education." "Education," Vivian laughed, and it came out slightly watery. "The most expensive education of my life. Worth every penny, I'd say." Eleanor smiled, and there was a warmth in her expression that reminded Vivian of all the reasons she loved this formidable woman. "Now get in the car. We have a lot to discuss, and I'd rather not do it on Julian Blackwell's doorstep." The convoy pulled away from the Blackwell estate, leaving behind the chaos and the scandal and the ruin of Vivian's marriage. Through the tinted windows, she watched the mansion grow smaller, the lights of the ballroom fading into the distance. Inside that building, Julian was probably still standing in shock. Helena was probably still arguing with lawyers. Margot was probably already planning how to distance herself from the disaster. And 200 guests were probably already composing the messages they would send to everyone they knew. Spreading the story of the night, the Blackwell Gala became the most talked about event in society history. But Vivian didn't care about any of that. She was going home. "What happens now?" she asked her grandmother. "Now, you come home," Eleanor replied, taking Vivian's hand in hers. "Now you meet the team of therapists and life coaches I've assembled to help you heal from this nightmare. Now you reconnect with your brothers and sister who have been absolutely insufferable in their worry about you. And Julian Blackwell will discover exactly how small his empire is compared to ours." Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike. "His investors will learn about his financial irregularities. His board will question his judgment. His precious merger will collapse. Within 6 months, Blackwell Industries will be worth a fraction of its current value." Vivian felt a pang of something complicated. "I don't want to destroy him, grandmother. I just want to be free of him." Eleanor's expression softened, and she squeezed her granddaughter's hand. "That speaks to your character, darling, but understand this. I'm not destroying him out of revenge. I'm protecting you. Men like Julian Blackwell don't accept defeat gracefully. If we don't neutralize his power now, he'll spend years trying to hurt you in whatever ways he can. This isn't vengeance. This is prevention." Vivian nodded slowly, understanding the logic even as part of her mourned the man Julian might have been. The convoy drove through the night, carrying Vivian away from the city that had been her home for 3.5 years, toward Connecticut, toward the Ashford estate, toward the family she had left behind in search of something real. She had found something real, she reflected, just not what she had been looking for. She had found the truth about Julian Blackwell, the truth about how easily love could be corrupted by ambition, the truth about her own strength, buried beneath years of careful diminishment but never truly destroyed. And she had found her way home. This is the part of the story where most people would want revenge. They'd want to see Julian suffer, lose everything, beg for mercy. And honestly, that's coming. Trust me. But Vivian's journey isn't really about Julian anymore. It's about something more powerful than revenge. It's about becoming the woman she was always meant to be. If you're rooting for Vivian's rise, smash that subscribe button and let's continue this journey together. The Ashford estate looked exactly as Vivian remembered it. 200 acres of manicured grounds lit softly by landscape lighting that made the property look like something from a dream. The main house rose from the darkness like a castle, its windows glowing warm and welcoming despite the late hour. Staff lined the entrance hall when Vivian walked through the doors she had left 3.5 years ago. Many of them were in tears. Margaret, the head housekeeper who had known Vivian since childhood. Thomas, the butler who had taught her to tie her shoes. Elena, the cook who had made her birthday cakes every year without fail. "Welcome home, Miss Vivian," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's so very good to have you back." Vivian hugged him, something she never would have done as a child. "It's good to be back, Thomas. I've missed you all so much." The grand staircase swept upward to the residential wings, and Vivian found herself drawn toward it automatically, toward her old room, toward the life she had left behind. "It's exactly as you left it," Eleanor said, reading her granddaughter's thoughts. "I gave instructions that nothing was to be changed." Vivian climbed the stairs slowly, her family following at a respectful distance. The hallway to her room was lined with photographs, images from her childhood and adolescence. Vivian at 5, covered in paint from her first serious art project. Vivian at 12, accepting an award for a school competition. Vivian at 18, graduating with honors. And on the wall outside her bedroom door, a photograph of her father. Richard Ashford had died 2 years ago. A heart attack that had taken him suddenly, without warning, without giving Vivian the chance to say goodbye. She had learned about it from a newspaper, deliberately avoiding contact with her family to maintain her experiment in ordinary life. The guilt of that choice washed over her now, fresh and sharp as the day she had first read the obituary. "He knew where you were," Eleanor said softly, appearing at Vivian's shoulder. "He always knew. He was proud of you for trying, Vivian. Proud of your courage, even when it meant missing you terribly. I should have come home." Vivian's voice was barely a whisper. "When I heard he was sick, I should have come. He understood why you didn't, and he wouldn't have wanted you to sacrifice your journey for his sake. He was stubborn that way." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. "You'll have time to grieve him properly now. To visit his grave, to say the things you never got to say. That's part of healing too." Vivian opened the door to her bedroom, and the sight that greeted her made her chest ache with a complicated mixture of joy and sorrow. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Her paintings from adolescence still hung on the walls. Her books still lined the shelves. Her art supplies still occupied the corner studio space where she had spent countless hours creating. And on her desk, a letter in her father's handwriting. "What is that?" Vivian asked, though she already knew. "He wrote it before he died," Eleanor replied. "He asked me to give it to you when you came home. He always knew you would come home eventually." Vivian picked up the letter with trembling hands, but she didn't open it. Not yet. Some things required privacy, required time, required the kind of emotional space she didn't have right now. "I'll read it tomorrow," she said, setting it carefully aside. "Tonight, I just want to be with my family." "Of course, darling." Eleanor kissed her granddaughter's forehead. "Rest now. Tomorrow we begin the work of rebuilding." The days that followed were a blur of family dinners, long conversations, and the slow process of remembering who she was before Julian Blackwell had systematically dismantled her sense of self. Isabella barely left her side for the first week. The youngest Ashford had grown into a formidable young woman during Vivian's absence, completing her degree at Yale and preparing to take her own place in the family business. But underneath the polish was still the little sister who had cried when Vivian left, who had sent unanswered letters for months afterward, who had never stopped hoping her big sister would come home. "Tell me everything," Isabella demanded one afternoon as they walked through the estate gardens. "Every terrible thing he did. I want to hate him properly." Vivian considered the request, then shook her head. "Hating him won't help either of us. He was broken in ways I couldn't fix, and I was broken in ways that made me vulnerable to his particular kind of cruelty. Understanding that is more useful than hatred. You're too forgiving, maybe. Or maybe forgiveness is just the fastest path to freedom." Conrad and Dominic were less philosophical in their approach. Both brothers had compiled extensive files on Julian Blackwell's business, dealings, personal relationships, and potential vulnerabilities. They presented these files to Vivian like generals preparing for war. "We can end him," Dominic said flatly. "Completely and permanently. He'll never recover." Vivian looked at the files, at the evidence of Julian's lies and manipulations, and petty cruelties and felt something she hadn't expected. Pity. He's going to end himself, she said finally. He doesn't need our help for that. Men like Julian can't accept failure. He'll self-destruct trying to prove he was right all along. And if he comes after you, Conrad demanded, if he tries to retaliate, then we'll respond proportionally. But I won't dedicate my life to destroying him. That would mean he still controlled my choices. And I'm done being controlled. Her brothers exchanged glances, clearly unsatisfied but willing to defer to her judgment. For now, the therapist Eleanor had hired was named Dr. Simone Reeves, a specialist in recovery from emotional abuse who had worked with survivors from all walks of life. The first session was the hardest. Tell me about your marriage, Dr. Reeves said, her voice calm and non-judgmental. Vivian sat in silence for a long moment, trying to find the words. It didn't start bad, she said finally. In the beginning, it was wonderful. He saw me, really saw me, in ways no one ever had. He made me feel special and valued and loved. And then, his company succeeded. And suddenly, I wasn't enough anymore. I wasn't sophisticated enough, polished enough, connected enough. Everything about me that he had once found charming became a source of embarrassment. How did that make you feel? Small. Vivian's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Invisible. Like I was slowly disappearing, and no one noticed because no one was looking for me in the first place. The sessions continued, twice a week at first, then weekly, then bi-weekly as Vivian's healing progressed. Dr. Reeves helped her identify the patterns of manipulation Julian had used, the gaslighting, the isolation, the subtle erosion of her confidence through constant criticism disguised as concern. It was abuse, Dr. Reeves said during one session. I know that word feels strong, but what you experienced fits every clinical definition. It didn't feel like abuse while it was happening, Vivian admitted. It just felt like I was failing, like if I could be better, do better, be more of what he needed, everything would be fine. That's how emotional abuse works. It makes you believe you're the problem. It keeps you focused on fixing yourself instead of recognizing that the relationship itself is broken. Vivian absorbed this information slowly, letting it settle into her understanding of what had happened to her. She began to see her marriage not as a personal failure, but as an experience she had survived, a trial that had revealed her own strength, even as it had temporarily obscured it. The art came back slowly. At first, Vivian couldn't even enter her studio. The thought of painting triggered memories of Julian's dismissive comments, his subtle suggestions that her art was a hobby rather than a calling, his eventual insistence that she stop creating altogether. But one morning, about 6 weeks after her return home, she woke before dawn and felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The urge to create. She went to her studio in her pajamas, pulling out canvases and paints that had been waiting for her return. The first brushstroke was hesitant. The second was bolder. By the time the sun rose, she was lost in the work, her hands moving with a certainty she had forgotten she possessed. The painting that emerged was dark and powerful, shadows consuming a figure who was simultaneously dissolving and reforming. Death and rebirth captured on a single canvas. Vivian stepped back and looked at what she had created. And for the first time in 3 years, she saw herself clearly. She was not the broken woman Julian had tried to make her. She was the woman who had survived him. The news from the outside world trickled in through family updates and occasional media reports. Julian Blackwell's empire was crumbling exactly as Eleanor had predicted. The financial irregularities revealed by the Ashford lawyers had triggered investigations that uncovered more problems than anyone had anticipated. Investors were fleeing. Board members were resigning. The Castellan merger had collapsed entirely when Margot's family realized that Julian was a liability rather than an asset. The media coverage shifted from business pages to gossip columns. The CEO who had publicly humiliated his wife only to discover she was worth billions. The society wedding of the century that never happened. The Castellan family's frantic attempts to distance themselves from the scandal. Julian was photographed leaving his penthouse looking haggard and diminished. His mother was photographed entering a spa known for treating anxiety and depression. Margot was photographed with a new man entirely, the Blackwell debacle apparently already forgotten. And through it all, Vivian stayed silent. She didn't give interviews. She didn't make public statements. She didn't participate in the media circus that was consuming Julian's downfall. She was too busy rebuilding herself to waste energy on his destruction. The gallery opening happened 8 months after Vivian returned home. The Ashford Contemporary Art Space was her grandmother's gift, a stunning venue in Manhattan that would showcase emerging artists and provide educational programs for underserved communities. And for its inaugural exhibition, it would feature Vivian's own work. The collection was called Emergence, 23 paintings that told the story of her journey from silenced wife to reclaimed woman. Dark works that captured the suffocation of her marriage, transitional pieces that showed the chaos of transformation, and finally, luminous canvases that celebrated the woman she was becoming. Critics who didn't know her backstory were moved by the universal truth in her work. Reviewers praised her emotional honesty, her technical brilliance, her ability to capture experiences that resonated with anyone who had ever felt lost and found their way home. The opening night was packed. Collectors, journalists, art enthusiasts, and curious society figures who wanted to see if the famous Ashford heiress lived up to the hype. Vivian moved through the crowd in a dress she had chosen herself. Not cream and forgettable, but deep blue and commanding. Not designed to help her disappear, but to announce her presence. "Your work is extraordinary," a man said, appearing at her elbow as she stood before her self-portrait. Vivian turned to find someone she didn't recognize. Tall, with kind eyes and an easy smile. No designer suit or calculated charm. Just genuine interest in the art he was observing. "Thank you," she replied, studying his face. "Do I know you?" "I don't think so. I'm Marcus Holloway. I run a foundation that brings art education to underserved communities. And you, apparently, are the artist everyone is talking about tonight. Vivian Ashford." "I know." He smiled. "Everyone knows. But I'm more interested in Vivian the artist than Vivian the heiress. Your work speaks to something real, something most gallery art is too polished to touch. You understand it." "I think I do." He turned to look at the self-portrait she had been contemplating. "This one especially. It's about standing on the edge of something new, being terrified and exhilarated at the same time, being alone but not lonely." Vivian stared at him. "That's exactly what I was trying to capture. Then, you succeeded." Marcus met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that made her breath catch. "Would you like to get coffee sometime? I'd love to discuss a potential partnership between your gallery and my foundation." It was a professional request, or at least it was framed as one. But there was something underneath the words that felt like more. Vivian considered the invitation. The cautious part of her, the part that had been so badly burned by Julian, wanted to decline. To protect herself, to stay safe in the fortress of her family and her work. But another part of her, the part that was slowly learning to trust again, recognized something genuine in this stranger's eyes. "I'd like that," she said. "Coffee sounds perfect." They exchanged cards. Marcus lingered for a few more minutes, discussing his foundation's mission with obvious passion. He spoke about children who had never been told. Their creativity mattered, about the transformative power of artistic expression, about his belief that art could change lives if given the chance. Vivian found herself leaning closer, genuinely interested, genuinely engaged. When he finally left, she stood alone with her paintings and felt something she had almost forgotten was possible: hope. The coffee meeting became dinner. Dinner became more dinners. Weeks of professional discussion gradually transformed into personal conversation, shared vulnerabilities, careful exploration of what might be growing between them. Marcus was nothing like Julian. Where Julian had been charming in a practiced way, Marcus was genuine without trying to be. Where Julian had asked questions to find angles for manipulation, Marcus asked questions because he truly wanted to understand. Where Julian had made Vivian feel like she needed to shrink to fit into his life, Marcus made space for her to expand. He met her family gradually. Conrad's protective interrogation, Dominic's subtle warnings, Isabella's enthusiastic approval, Eleanor's careful observation. "I like him," Eleanor said one evening, after Marcus had left from a family dinner. "He's not interested in your fortune. He's interested in you. How can you tell?" "Because he argued with you about art theory for an hour without once backing down because you're an Ashford." Eleanor smiled. Only a man secure in himself can disagree with a billionaire and not apologize for it. The relationship progressed slowly. Vivian needed it to be slow. She was still healing, still learning to trust, still figuring out how to be in a relationship without losing herself. Marcus understood. He never pushed. He never demanded. He simply showed up, consistently and reliably, proving through actions rather than words that he was safe. Their first kiss happened 4 months after they met, walking through Central Park after a gallery opening. Stars overhead, the city glittering around them. "I've been wanting to do that for a while," Marcus admitted, his forehead resting against hers. "Why didn't you?" "Because you needed time, and you're worth waiting for." Vivian felt tears pricking at her eyes. No one had ever said that to her before. No one had ever made her feel like her healing was a priority rather than an inconvenience. "I'm falling in love with you," she whispered. "It terrifies me." Marcus pulled back to look into her eyes. "I'm falling in love with you too, and we can be terrified together." 1 year after the gala night, Vivian received a message that Julian wanted to see her. Her first instinct was to refuse, to delete the message and pretend it had never come, to protect herself from whatever pain he might still be able to inflict. But her therapist suggested otherwise. Closure can be healing. Dr. Reeves said, but only if you're strong enough to maintain your boundaries. Are you? Vivian considered the question honestly. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, standing frozen in that ballroom while her husband destroyed her. Then she thought about the woman she had become, the artist, the philanthropist, the woman learning to love again with eyes wide open. "I think I am," she said finally. The meeting took place at a quiet cafe far from society eyes. Julian arrived first. Vivian saw him through the window as she approached, and she almost didn't recognize him. He looked older, broken. The confident CEO who had commanded 200 people's attention was gone, replaced by a man who had lost everything he thought mattered. "Vivian." He stood when she entered, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank you for coming." She sat across from him, noting the changes, the weight loss, the gray in his hair, the haunted look in his eyes. "You wanted to talk," she said. "So talk." Julian was silent for a long moment, gathering his words. "I've lost everything," he said finally. "The company, the investors, the reputation. Margot left months ago. My mother isn't speaking to me. I have nothing left." Vivian waited. "And the worst part," Julian continued, "the worst part is that I realize now. I had everything when I had you. I had a wife who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. I had a partner who believed in me when no one else did. I had something real, and I destroyed it because I was too blind to see its value. Julian, I'm not asking for forgiveness." He held up his hand. "I know I don't deserve that. I'm not asking for another chance. I burned that bridge beyond repair. I just needed you to know that I understand now. I understand what I lost. I understand what I did to you. And I'm sorry. I'm genuinely, deeply sorry." Vivian studied the man she had once loved, the man who had made her believe she wasn't enough, the man who had tried to erase her and nearly succeeded. "I believe you're sorry," she said finally, "and maybe someday I'll be able to forgive you. But not today. Today, I'm just grateful that I got out, that I found my way back to myself, that I didn't let what you did to me define the rest of my life." Julian nodded, accepting the boundary without protest. "You deserve every happiness," he said quietly. "The man you're with, Marcus, he's lucky to have you. I hope he knows that." "He does." Vivian stood, preparing to leave. "Goodbye, Julian. I hope you find peace, but you'll have to find it without me." She walked out of the cafe without looking back. The past was behind her. The future was waiting. And for the first time since that terrible night at the gala, Vivian Ashford felt completely free. The wedding happened 2 years after they met. Not at the Ashford estate, though Eleanor offered. Not at some society venue with hundreds of important guests. They chose a garden in Tuscany, surrounded by olive trees and wildflowers, with only the people who truly mattered in attendance. Vivian wore a dress she had designed herself. Not cream and forgettable, but ivory and bold, with hand-painted details along the hem that told the story of her journey. Marcus waited at the altar with tears in his eyes. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen," he said as she reached him. "You're biased, absolutely, and completely right." The vows they exchanged were honest and imperfect. Promises to grow together, to support each other's dreams, to be partners in everything that mattered, to love without conditions or expectations. "I spent years looking for someone who would love me for myself," Vivian said, "and I finally found him. But more importantly, I found myself first. I learned that I am worthy of love, that my worth isn't determined by anyone else's opinion, that the only person who gets to define me is me. I vow to remind you of that every day." Marcus replied, "On the days you believe it and the days you forget." When they kissed to seal their marriage, the applause was genuine and joyful. Eleanor wiped away tears she would later deny. Isabella sobbed openly. Conrad and Dominic exchanged looks of approval, and in the front row, a seat remained empty for Richard Ashford, who had never stopped believing his daughter would find her way home, whose letter, finally read on the one-year anniversary of her return, had contained words that Vivian carried with her every day. "My darling Vivian, your mother always said you were the brave one, the one who would take the leap the rest of us were too afraid to take. I know your journey hasn't been easy. I know there have been moments when you questioned whether you made the right choice, but I want you to know that I have never been prouder of you. Not for your name, not for your talent, not for anything you've achieved. I'm proud of you for having the courage to discover who you are. That's the greatest gift anyone can give themselves. I love you. I always have. And wherever your path leads, I'll be watching from wherever I am, cheering you on. Find someone who deserves you. And if you never do, remember that you're complete on your own. Your loving father." Vivian had found someone who deserved her, and she had found herself first. The foundation expanded to 20 cities within 5 years. Art therapy programs for abuse survivors, educational initiatives for underserved children, gallery spaces that showcased emerging artists who would never have been seen otherwise. Marcus and Vivian built something meaningful together, using their combined resources to change lives. Her paintings hung in museums around the world now. Critics called her one of the most significant artists of her generation. But she never forgot the tiny apartment in Brooklyn, the children she had taught, the years when no one knew her name, and she had created just for the joy of creating. Julian Blackwell eventually rebuilt something, a smaller company, a quieter life. He remarried years later to a woman who seemed genuinely kind, and they had 2 children who reportedly adored their father. Vivian never spoke to him again, but when she heard about his children, she felt something like satisfaction, not for Julian's sake, but because it meant his story wasn't only tragedy. People could change, people could grow, people could learn from their worst mistakes and become better. She hoped that was true for him. She knew it was true for her. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the power of rising from ashes, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that their worth is never determined by how others see them. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had to walk away from someone who couldn't see your value? Have you ever risen from your lowest moment to become the person you were meant to be? I read every single comment, and I want to hear your story. Remember, sometimes the greatest gift comes from our greatest losses. Sometimes the people who hurt us most teach us lessons we needed to learn. And sometimes the love we're searching for is waiting at home once we become the person worthy of receiving it. Vivian Ashford walked away from billions to find herself. She lost herself in a marriage that tried to erase her. And she emerged stronger, wiser, and more herself than she had ever been. That's the real happily ever after. Not finding someone to complete you, but becoming complete on your own, and then choosing to share that completeness with someone who deserves it. Until next time, this is Mr. Brad reminding you that every ending is just a beginning in disguise.